Chapter 3, Structure and Function of Cells, Screencast 3. Now, the topic that's covered in this screencast for Chapter 3 is focusing on metabolic pathways. Now, before I get too much further in this screencast, I want to direct you to the lecture materials folder for Chapter 3 in Blackboard. What you'll find there is a document entitled Focus Questions for Metabolism. So that is where you should concentrate your studying for this topic. I probably will go a little bit more in depth, but be comfortable with those questions because those are the types of questions, or very similar, that you'll be seeing on the upcoming exam. So first off, we want to talk about metabolism overall. Metabolism is defined as the sum of all chemical reactions that occur or are taking place in an organism. We want to break it down into two general types of pathways. Some are anabolic. So think once again, anabolic. And anabolic, we're talking about larger molecules being assembled from smaller ones. We saw this when we talked about protein production from amino acids, or a polysaccharide being produced from monosaccharides. Now, the thing we need to remember here is when we talk about anabolic pathways, they require the input of energy, or ATP input. The opposite is going to be catabolism, or catabolic pathways. And now we're looking at larger molecules being broken down. And the thing we want to remember here, catabolic pathways result in the release of energy. So really we're looking at a balance. I'm going to make ATP, I'm going to break it down, and so on, continuing all the time. And our cells are producing vast quantities of ATP that are necessary to sustain normal biological function. Now, as noted, every chemical reaction in our body is going to require an enzyme. And one of the things we have to keep in mind here is ATP, as indicated previously, that is the cellular energy currency. So that is exactly what cells are using to fuel their processes. So not glucose, not triglycerides. We're going to use those substrates to actually produce ATP. So that's a very important thing for you to keep in mind. Now here, there are a couple things that you are required to remember. I want you to remember that 1 glucose will yield 36 ATP per glucose oxidation. So this is oxidative pathways, okay? So that is something that is especially important for you to keep in mind. Now here, we can take a look at a couple of things. So I have glucose, okay, combining with oxygen. So there's that oxygen. Here's cellular respiration. And look what we're getting. Okay, we're going to get some CO2, water. I don't care about the amount. We're not balancing this equation. But what I do want you to be comfortable with is approximately 36 ATP per glucose molecule when oxidized in the presence of oxygen. Now, that ATP is going to be utilized to do all sorts of cellular work. It could be anabolic pathways, so I'm going to create things. Transport, such as active transport mechanisms, which we introduced in the previous screencast, and also muscle contraction. So all of this requires ATP. And as I said, we're going to get ATP from glucose. We're going to start there, okay? Now here, this is a summary diagram, and what I want you to keep in mind here are a couple of things. One thing that you're going to see here is glycolysis and where it takes place, okay? So notice I have 3 pathways taking place within the mitochondria. I have the prep step, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport system. Okay? So notice, remember, we introduced the mitochondria in the first screencast as the cellular powerhouse. So here we can see where oxygen is going to be used in cellular respiration to produce ATP. What I want to note here is glycolysis is a pathway that is not taking place within the mitochondria. Okay, so it's not linked. All right. So what we want to remember here is overall, I see 3 pathways that result in ATP. We have glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport system. Okay? I want you to keep that in mind. Okay. Now what we're going to do next is take a deeper dive looking at these different pathways. The first is glycolysis. And so remember, this takes place in the cytoplasm and not in the mitochondria. Okay? That's important. Now we're starting off with glucose. Okay. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. Okay. Now glucose is 6 carbons. All right. So at the end, what we're going to end up with at the end of glycolysis is 2 3-carbon substances, 2 pyruvate. Okay? I didn't lose a carbon. That's important. Okay. I started with 6. I ended up with 6, just arranged differently. Okay. Now, the other thing that you have to keep in mind here is glycolysis actually requires some ATP to be invested in the beginning. So it's not a freebie. All right. Now, when we look at the amount of energy that I'm actually getting out of glycolysis, it's actually a net. Okay. So it's a net of 2 ATP. All right. Want us to remember that. The other thing that's happening here, and we'll see this in a lot of other pathways, is over here where it's NADH, we're going to refer to that as electron transport molecules. Okay, so don't get caught up in NADH or any of that. It's an electron transport molecule. And remember, we've got a pathway called the electron transport system. So we're going to revisit these electron transport molecules once we start talking about the electron transport system. Now, I have a prep step. Okay, and now this is how we basically get to acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is the entryway into the next step, the citric acid cycle. But I want to point something out here. Okay, so look, I have 3 carbons, right? Okay, now acetyl-CoA. This is a 2-carbon substance. But notice I didn't lose a carbon. Okay, there's some CO2 being produced. So the CO2 that we exhale is basically produced in 2 steps. All right, this is one of them, okay? And we'll see a little bit later. Now also notice I'm going to end up with an electron transport molecule, okay? And this is acetyl-CoA. But also remember, I have 2 of these per glucose. All right, so we kind of have to remember that. Next is the citric acid cycle. Okay, or formerly known the Krebs cycle. Now, what I want us to remember here is we're using acetyl-CoA, which we saw as a result of the prep step. All right, so that's the gateway. All right, now also remember, since I had 2 pyruvate, 2 acetyl-CoA, the citric acid cycle will spin twice per glucose. Okay, important. Now, we want to take a look at what we're actually getting out of this. All right. Now, I do get some ATP, okay, but what I'm also getting is CO2. So remember, okay, there are 2 pathways where CO2 is actually produced: the prep step and here in the citric acid or Krebs cycle. Okay, if I had to pick the most important thing that's happening here, it's going to be the generation of more electron transport molecules. It's really not ATP production because I'm not getting a lot. Remember, per glucose, we're going to get approximately 36. All right, so keep that in mind also. So now, this is the last step. This is the electron transport system. This is the only step that actually uses oxygen. Okay, and the role of oxygen in aerobic oxidation is to act as a final electron acceptor. And I'll say that again. The role of oxygen in the electron transport system is to act as a final electron acceptor. Now remember, along the way, we produce a lot of electron transport molecules. So this is what's happening here. During the electron transport system, these electrons are going to be moved through these structures within the inner membrane. And as that's happening, the energy used in those electrons moving through these structures, I'm going to pump a lot of hydrogen ions into that outer membrane. Okay? Now over here, this is a membrane protein specific to hydrogen ions. It's actually called ATP synthase. So now as hydrogen ions move through, the energy associated as they move through is used to make ATP. So that's how we do it. Now over here, okay, something's got to be around to pick up those those electrons. That's what oxygen does. And remember, the role of oxygen is to act as the final electron acceptor. Okay, so that's something that I want you to keep in mind. Okay? Now, generally, when we look at the summary of energy produced from glucose, there's over 20 different enzyme catalyzed reactions. As I said before, the oxidation of glucose in the presence of oxygen will approximately net 36 ATP. We're going to also produce along the way CO2 and water. Okay? Now, cellular respiration, that's the process that uses oxygen and produces CO2 as ATP is being produced. Now, this is a pretty good summary step. Okay, so what we're showing here, all of these are electron transport molecules, and look what they're going. Okay, they're all going over here. Now notice I have a total of 3 steps that result in ATP. I get a net of 2 from glycolysis. I get another 2 from the 2 spins of the citric acid cycle. Remember, 2 spins per glucose. And look at how many I get from the electron transport system. About 34. So the majority of ATP that I get is coming from the electron transport chain. Now remember, this is only when we talk about the complete oxidation of glucose in the presence of oxygen. All right? Now, when we look at energy in our body, okay, so remember, we have glycogen, which we store in the form of glucose, and we can break that down pretty rapidly. So when we need energy pretty quickly, it's pretty much going to be glucose. Now, it only accounts for 1% of total energy stores within our body. Now, fat makes up the most. All right, 78% of total energy in our body is stored as fat. Now, the thing that we have to remember, fat is energy dense. It has double the amount of energy than carbohydrates. So fat's a great way to store energy. But remember when we talked about fatty acids and all of that, how long carbon chains? It's not as easy to get energy out of fat because it's such a big molecule. Glucose, remember, it's only 6 carbons. I can break that down pretty quickly and get the energy I need pretty fast. But once again, I've got limited stores. All right. Protein, about 21% of total energy reserves. Now, I can get energy from protein, and protein has the same amount of energy as carbohydrates, but I don't want to use protein for energy. Remember all the other functions associated with protein? I wanted to do that. I don't want to use protein as a primary energy source. That's what carbohydrate and lipids are for. All right. Now here, okay, so once again, we're looking at just an overview, but this is a little different because I want us to take a look. Now notice no new metabolic pathways here. All right. I see fat. I can get energy, okay, as acetyl-CoA. The fatty acids, I see glycerol, okay, going in as pyruvate into the prep step and so on. We already know what glucose does, all right? And if I look at protein, okay, no new pathways here, okay? So basically, I'm using the same pathways we learned about glucose oxidation to get energy from fatty acids, glycerol, and amino acids. All right, that's a really important concept, and you may refer or see it referred to as a metabolic mill. Okay, now all of these are going on at the same time within our body. Okay, that makes this a little confusing. All right, so a couple of things we need to remember. The intensity of what our body is doing is going to dictate what energy reserves we're going to use primarily. Okay, if I need energy really fat, then I'm going to have to get that energy from carbohydrate. If I'm just hanging out on the couch watching some hockey, that's not really intense. So now I'm giving my body the opportunity to actually utilize my fat stores. Okay, so keep that in mind because I think that's a really important concept here. Now, there are going to be situations, especially when the exercise intensity is really high, we cannot continue cellular respiration because there's not enough oxygen available. Now, glycolysis will continue because remember, it's not in the mitochondria. All right, so that's a good thing. All right, so when there's no oxygen available, I pretty much shut down the production of ATP in the mitochondria. Glycolysis actually takes place in the cytoplasm. So it's not great, but I don't know about you, 2 ATP is better than no ATP. Okay, so let's kind of think about this a little bit. All right, so now remember what I said previously. The complete oxidation of glucose in the presence of oxygen is going to give me approximately 36 ATP. When oxygen is not available, I'm only going to get 2. And as I said, some ATP is better than no ATP. Okay? Now, I'm going to use an example here. Okay? So when the government runs out of money, okay, what Congress has to do is write a stopgap measure. So that allows to keep the government going. This is what the lactic acid buildup is. Okay, so what we have here is a cellular stopgap measure. And so what it's doing is providing some energy, and what's happening here is the ability to produce some ATP. And the product of that is going to be lactic acid. Now, lactic acid buildup will contribute to fatigue. Now, I want to stay away from that saying, feel the burn. Okay? You are not creating an acid environment in your body. What you are doing, that acid, okay, will stimulate some pain receptors. And that's where we start to feel the pain associated with really, really intense exercise. Eventually, you're going to have to stop because of the contribution of lactic acid buildup to fatigue. Okay, so really important. I want us to keep that in mind. Okay, so when oxygen is not available, I can only get 2 ATP out of glucose. Now, when oxygen becomes available, then I can get back to pyruvate, and there are actually some tissues in our body that can use lactic acid. I don't want you to think of lactic acid as an endpoint because it really isn't. Okay? The heart can use lactic acid for energy. Now here, this is an animation that talks about breaking down glucose for energy, and I suggest that you take some time and watch this. Okay?